All right, I'm Terry Camerzell here on behalf of Creation Fellowship Santee. We're a group of friends who love to learn about our Creator God and believe that the Bible, when read properly, rules out the possibility of long ages. Our goal is to equip Christians to give an answer for the hope that lies within them. Today is the 100th anniversary of the start of the landmark Scopes monkey trial, and we're here for our part two presentation on the implications of that trial. If you missed part one with Frank Sherwin of ICR telling us the scientific implications, you can visit tinyurl.com/CFS archives. That's C like creation, F like fellowship, S like Santee, and the word archives, where you will also find links to over 5 years worth of over 100 virtually there speakers. Tonight, we're going to learn about the legal implication of the trial from attorney Barbara Weller. Barbara earned her bachelor degree from Albright College in Reading, Pennsylvania, and graduated from the Biblical Theological Seminary in Hatfield, Pennsylvania, where she studied Hebrew and theology. As a pastor's wife and mom of three, Barbara did a lot of teaching and church advocate work until God called her to a second career. She earned her law degree from Regent University School of Law in Virginia Beach and was admitted both to the Florida Bar and the U.S. Supreme Court Bar. For the last 30 years, Barbara has been working with attorney David Gibbs III, another past CFS speaker from the National Center for Life and Liberty. One of the most well known cases they worked on together was that of Terry Schiavo, which unfortunately became the first time in American history that a local civil court judge ordered the death of an innocent person who had never committed a crime, but who was merely severely disabled. Barbara's ongoing work protecting the legal rights of churches and other religious organizations gives her a good understanding of the implications the Scopes monkey trial had on America's legal system. With that, Barbara, I'm happy to turn it over to you.
Thank you very much. I'm really glad to be here tonight because talking about the evolution of American law gives me an opportunity to do something that has really been a goal of mine for ever since I got out of law school, and that is to share with Americans how the Darwinian evolutionary theory actually influenced American law just as much as it influenced biology. And spoiler alert, that influence was not in a good direction. Uh, the way that I learned all this was from my mentor in law school. His name was Herbert Titus. He's gone on to be with the Lord now for several years, but he wrote a wonderful book called God, Man, and Law, The Biblical Principles. He was writing that book while I was studying constitutional law with him back in 1994, 1995. Most of us in the law class, including myself, pretty much had no idea most of the time what he was talking about. Eventually we figured it out, but his book is pretty complicated. And so one of my goals in life has been to sort of translate his origins of American law in that book to language that common Americans can all understand. So I'm just very happy to be able to do some of that tonight, and also to be able to warn Americans about how much the law today has slipped away from that law that America's founders thought that America would always follow. And that just using that word slipping away just gives you the clue that that this has been an evolutionary process, and it was a purposeful evolutionary process. But before we talk, I actually have a theory about that. My theory is that the reason that scientists wanted to adopt Darwinian evolution, and the reason that even lawyers wanted to adopt evolution, was just because they didn't want to have to listen to what God said. They wanted to escape from God's sovereignty over themselves, over science, and over our nation's laws, and over the universe. And that's the reason that scientists and legal scholars have been so eager to adopt evolutionary principles because they just don't want to be accountable to God. That's really the bottom line. And this sliding away from the law, as our founders had assumed it would be, because they founded America to be a Christian nation, that all started around the beginning of the 20th century, and especially during the 1920s, which of course 1925 was when the Scopes monkey trial was blaring out of radios all across America, and that trial was intended to begin to plant in people's minds the fact that they didn't need God because now they had evolution, so they could forget about God. So we'll talk a little more about the law later on this evening, but we want to start out by talking about the Scopes trial itself. And the first interesting thing that I want to mention about that trial is that just like the later case in 1973 of Roe versus Wade, the Scopes monkey trial was actually based on a lie, just like the Roe versus Wade case was based on a lie. Jane Roe, in that case, her real name was Norma McCorvey, who was the plaintiff supposedly in that case. She never got an abortion. In fact, she never wanted an abortion. She had a beautiful baby girl in 1970, 3 years before that case even went to the Supreme Court. But some unscrupulous lawyers used her anyway as a plaintiff just to get to the court and have the court be able to decide that Americans, women had a constitutional right to kill their babies before they were born. So that case was based on a lie. And in the same way, the Scopes monkey trial was based on a lie. John Scopes never actually taught evolution. He was a science teacher, but he had never actually taught evolution in his science classes. But the American Civil Liberties Union, the ACLU, and they're still very active today, they wanted to find somebody that they could have arrested for teaching evolution, just so that they could bring this issue before the American public and begin to argue that creation, there is no such thing as creation, that it's evolution, that Charles Darwin was right. So that really was a lie. In March of 1925, the Tennessee legislature had enacted a law they called the Butler Act. And what the Butler Act said was that it was prohibited to teach anything except the divine origin of, in other words, creation, that it was illegal to teach anything other than creation in America's public school science classes. And in fact, the only thing that could be taught that could not be taught was evolution. So the Butler Act said you cannot teach evolution in America's public schools. So as a side note, it wasn't until the 1970s that lawyers were actually able to go out and look for clients to try and make legal points. As far back as the late 1800s, there would be lawyers who would go to railroad accidents and look for clients who were injured to be able to sue the railroads. But it really wasn't until the 1970s that they were able to do that. But the ACLU didn't care about any of that. They had organized in 1920, and in 1925, they started looking for a client that they could use to, to start to promote their ideas about evolution. As a side note here, just kind of to throw this in as a side note, many years ago, actually, I had a very politically active Christian friend whose name I won't mention. If I mentioned the name, you would know the family, but I'm not going to mention it here because we don't know where this is going, and I don't want to be sued for violation of privacy or slander or anything. So, but my friend told me that she remembered as a little girl that she would sit under her parents' dining room table, and this was back in the 20s and 30s, and she would listen to them talking about how they and their friends had a goal of moving America away from God. And they were going to do this through Darwinian evolutionary principles. And the people at that time that they were helping they were helping John Dewey. You probably know him from the Dewey Decimal System. But his goal, he was one of the people that would meet around her parents' dining room table, and they would talk about, getting God out of America. And he wanted to do it through the public schools. And we've seen that he actually now has been very successful in that. The other person that they were involved with was Margaret Sanger, and she had actually started her first Planned Parenthood clinic in 1916. And her goal was to rid America of what she thought of as the unworthy lower classes. And by that, she primarily meant former Black slaves. She thought they were unworthy and they shouldn't be allowed to reproduce. So she started the birth control clinics back in 1916 for that goal. And then, of course, Roger Baldwin was the person who started the American Civil Liberties Union in 1920. So all these people would sit around my friend's dining room table and talk about their plans for the future in getting God out. And of course, we've seen now they've been pretty successful in doing that. So anyway, back to Scopes. It didn't take long for the ACLU to find John Scopes, who was a teacher willing to challenge the Butler Act. As I said, the Butler Act was passed in March of 2025. And just 4 months later, they had already found John Scopes, and he had agreed to be their man. And so, as we heard earlier, by today, July the 10th in 1925, the first trial of the century, the Scopes monkey trial, was started. Now, as I said, it was based on a lie because John Scopes had never actually taught evolution in his class, just like Jane Roe never had an abortion. But John Scopes did what many politicians do today when they talk about or they testify in Congress or talk on television. He basically said, well, he couldn't really remember whether he had actually taught evolution or not, but he thought maybe he had, and so he got himself arrested for doing that. Really, the ACLU didn't care whether or not he had actually taught evolution. That wasn't their point. Their point was just to try to get the whole concept of evolution out before the American public. And like, I guess maybe what we would say today, the ACLU wanted to move the Overton window so that something that would previously have been considered unthinkable would eventually become acceptable and would even turn into policy. So that was their goal when the trial began. Now, when the trial ended, John Scopes obviously was found guilty because he'd said he thought he had maybe taught evolution, even though he really never had. And he was fined $100. But once again, the fact that he was found guilty wasn't really the point of the ACLU in doing this case. They were just trying to get evolution in front of the public. So the official name of the Scopes monkey trial was the state of Tennessee versus John Thomas Scopes, and it took place in the little town of Dayton, Tennessee. This trial became a national spectacle that symbolized the growing cultural risk at that time. You can sort of think of how popular it was by thinking about the O.J. Simpson trial in 1995, toward the end of the 20th century. That trial was televised, and everybody in America was watching it because, of course, O.J. Simpson was a very famous football player. And actually, that took place during the time that I was in law school. So I would rush home from my classes every day so I could put the TV on and watch the trial like everybody else in America did. And the Scopes monkey trial was actually the first trial in America that was actually broadcast on the radio. So everybody in the country would just gather around their radio, and the journalists were all there. They were just flooding into the town and reporting on this, and everybody was very interested in it and listening to it on the radio. So the reason that the town of Dayton had encouraged John Scopes to say that he had taught evolution was because they really wanted to get their town on the map and to bring a lot of business into their town. So So they were quite happy with John Scopes lying about whether or not he had taught evolution. So what the Scopes trial really was was at that time in 1920 there was a struggle going on in America between progressivism or modernism and traditional biblical Christianity, which was what most Americans still believed at that time. Um, the That was also going on in the Presbyterian Church between the old light and the new light. It was going on in education with John Dewey, and it also was going on with Margaret Sanger's eugenics issues with Planned Parenthood. Excuse me. So I have to interview Marco Rubio every now and then and take a drink. Now, another interesting legal fact about the Scopes trial was that the Butler Act itself, which was prohibiting teaching evolution in America's public school science classroom, that act itself was never affected by the trial. John Scopes was found guilty. The ACLU had fulfilled their goal and gotten evolution in front of the American public. But the Butler Act actually remained in effect in Tennessee for another 40 years. In fact, it was not until May of 1967 that the Supreme Court of the United States, in a case called Epperson versus Arkansas, actually found that teaching creation in America's schools was unconstitutional. So you can see the evolution there over 40 years. It came from the Butler Act in 1925 saying that you could not teach evolution in public schools, to now in 1967, you couldn't teach creation anymore in public schools. And then in good evolutionary fashion, in 1968, the United States Supreme Court actually held in the case of Epperson versus Arkansas that, like I said, it was unconstitutional under the Establishment Clause of the First Amendment to teach creation. So at that point in 1968, the creation was outlawed and evolution became the only thing that could be taught in public schools. And the rationale of the Supreme Court at that time was that under the First Amendment Establishment Clause, they said that creation was a religion, and you couldn't teach religion in public schools, and therefore you couldn't teach creation in public schools. Now, what the court completely overlooked was that for 300 years before that, starting at the time of the Pilgrims, all American public schools used the Bible. They used the Bible to learn to read. Their reading books didn't say see, spot, run. They said A is for Adam, B is for the Bible, the best book of all. So for 300 years, that had been what was taught in American schools. But now, after 1968, creation and religion could no longer be taught in our schools. So, as I said, the Scopes trial was very popular, partly at least because it was really the first American court case that was ever actually broadcast on live on the radio, just like O.J. Simpson trial was in TV 50 years later. And they brought some really famous people to Dayton to do this trial. Some of the biggest legal personalities of the 1920s came to Dayton to do the trial. William Jennings Bryan, at that time, was one of the most famous orators in America. And he was a Christian, and he believed the Bible, and he believed in creation, and he volunteered to prosecute John Scopes for violating the Butler Act and teaching evolution in his public school science class. Bryan was a three-time losing Democratic presidential candidate, so everybody in America knew who he was. And as I said, he was a devout Christian, and he viewed evolution as really a threat to America's most basic moral values and Christian religious beliefs. Uh, Bi Brian also agreed to serve as an expert witness on the Bible during the trial. The other famous person who was brought by the ACLU to Dayton, Tennessee, he defended John Scopes. He was a famous orator and defense attorney, and probably the most famous orator and defense attorney in U.S. history at that time. And Clarence Darrow was a very vocal agnostic, in contrast um, to Brian. So he actually, there were two other attorneys, Neil and I can't remember the other guy's name. They were there, but they really weren't the stars of the show. Clarence Darrow and William Jennings Bryan were the stars of the show. So Clarence Darrow's cross-examination of William Jennings Bryan uh, as the expert witness for the Bible in the trial, it really remains one of the most famous moments in American legal history. Brian wasn't a scientist, even though he had agreed to testify as an expert on the Bible. Um, and Darrow used that opportunity to expose what he believed and what many others believed were the inconsistencies in the Bible and in a literalist interpretation of the Bible. So Darrow's cross-examination went on for a long time, several days, and he asked Brian questions like about the creation account in Genesis, about Jonah and the whale. He asked where Cain and Abel got their wives. He asked whether Brian believed that it was a literal 6 day or 6 days that God created the earth, and whether it was really possible for Jonah to be swallowed by a whale. Uh, so his cross-examination was very successful, and he was very successful in embarrassing Brian and embarrassing people who believed in the Bible. So what's actually gotten very interesting since that time is that actually, as it's turned out over time, over the last 100 years since the trial occurred, what's happened in that time is that it turns out that Clarence Darrow, was actually wrong about the Bible and creation, and William Jennings Bryan was actually right. Today, the Bible and creation, well, especially the Bible, can be supported by science and archaeology, and something that has really occurred over the last 100 years. Um, for instance, and probably your speaker last week discussed some of this, but um, DNA, of course, has been discovered since then. And from what we know about DNA, we know that it's totally impossible for evolution to have occurred because the way that our DNA is composed, it requires an intelligent designer. All this couldn't just evolve. It had to have an intelligent mind creating it, because our DNA is so complex that it really had to be created, and couldn't just happen by chance. So that has, if they had known that in 100 years ago, Darrow's questioning would not have been so successful. And then the other thing that I just learned recently, but that I think is so interesting, and some of you may have seen this on the news, but actually, just within this year, within 2025, there was actually a man off the coast of Chile who was actually swallowed and spit out by a whale. I mean, it actually happened. And we know it happened because this guy was a 24-year-old kayaker who was kayaking off the coast of Chile. And his father at the time was actually photographing him. He was actually videotaping him. And so the videotape actually shows the whale swallowing the guy in the kayak and then a little bit later spitting them out again. Amazing. And also, I had not known this either, but back in June of 2021, there was actually a lobster diver off the coast of Cape Cod in Massachusetts who was also swallowed by a whale and then spit out a little bit later. And in fact, he was actually injured, so he went to the hospital. And so we do have evidence, from his injuries that this actually did happen. So it would have been a little difficult for Darrow to have questioned William Jennings Bryan about how it would have been impossible for a whale to swallow Jonah, when now today we know that it would have been possible. And also, we now have the Big Bang Theory with regard to the creation of the universe. And these days, and I'm sure your speaker last week talked about this too, but we now know from the way the universe is set up that it had to have a start time. In other words, the universe started at a particular point and spread out from there. And it's amazing that the earth, just not by chance, obviously, became the perfect place for mankind to live on. So we know, even now from the creation of the universe that it needed to have some kind of a designer, some kind of a mover or designer to get that whole process started. So we're able to see now that all these things that Clarence Darrow was ridiculing William Jennings Bryan about were really things that um, that could happen and that have happened now that we know more about it. The other thing that I think is very interesting is that just not too long ago, a theologian named Rick Renner, who's an American, but he actually has lived in Russia for many decades. Rick Renner, Renner, he actually has been to the site of Noah's Ark in the Turkish mountains. Apparently, and this is a very interesting coordination here. But the same month that Israel became a nation in 1948, there was an earthquake in Turkey, and the earthquake removed the mud around an object that looks very much like the Ark. And there's actually pictures of it now that I've seen on TV and that are in Rick Renner's book. And right next to the Ark, there's a huge giant stone, which is looks like it was the place where Noah worshiped God after the Ark landed. So now we even know that there was a real Noah's Ark and a real flood, something that Clarence Darrow and William Jennings Bryan didn't know at the time of the Scopes monkey trial. So I'll refer you. You can look up Rick Renner and the Ark, and you'll see those pictures. In fact, I heard Rick Renner speak about this and show his slides, and he actually said that the town nearest where the Ark is called the place of the landing, and that centuries ago, early Christians actually would go by there. It was on part of the Silk Road to China. And when merchants and people would pass by there, they would actually chip off little pieces of the Ark or of the stone and take them with them and wear them as amulets around their neck. And the people who live in this little town that's called Place of the Landing said, well, sure, we always knew the Ark was there. But then it got buried for a long, long time until, like I said, interestingly, in 1948, the same month that Israel became a nation, the earthquake uncovered it, and now we can't see it because it's still covered with mud, but they've flown drones over it, and they've taken dimensions, and the dimensions exactly mirror the dimensions of the Ark in the Old Testament. So basically, if the cross-examination of Bryan by Darrow were to take place today, 100 years later, what happened in 1925 could not have happened today, and Bryan would not have been as embarrassed as he was then. In fact, Interestingly enough, William Jennings Bryan died 5 days after the trial ended, and some people thought that he had actually died of stress from this antagonistic questioning by um, Clarence Darrow. But in fact, his death certificate said that he had died of what they called back then apoplexy, which today we would call a stroke. But whatever caused his death, Darrow or Bryan had been had been very much a leader in the whole pushback against Darwinian evolution. And so when he died, a lot of that spark of that pushback against evolution and holding on to creation, it just lost a lot of its spark, and it left room now for the ACLU to keep pushing evolution onto America and onto America's schools, which, as we've seen, they finally accomplished in 1968. We have to remember that the people like the ACLU and those on the left are very patient. They're willing to wait many years for their theories to become accepted. So we have to make sure that we as Christians show the same patience and the same persistence in pushing forward the things that we know now about why creation is really the only intelligent theory to have. So I want to turn now for just a few minutes to the fact that our America was founded as a Christian nation. Now, when I say that, I don't mean what I don't know, people who don't like us now are calling Christian nationalists. That is not a Christian. I don't even know what Christian nationalism means. But the fact that America was founded as a Christian nation doesn't mean that that everybody in America has to be a Christian. What it does mean is that our American laws, when our founders founded this country, they founded it on believing that the laws should be God's laws from the Bible. In fact, what they called it was fixed, uniform, and universal, unchanging laws that God had set down, not only for creation, but also for humanity and for the universe, and for us as people, individuals, and also for various nations. Benjamin Franklin was actually one of only 2 or 3 of our founders who were actually considered to be deists, people who believed that God set the world in motion, but then he kind of withdrew from it. The other founders did not believe that. In fact, George Washington said after the evolution that he couldn't imagine anybody not believing that God had helped America to win that war. And so the vast majority of our founders were Bible-believing Christians. And they actually put those biblical beliefs into our Declaration of Independence and into our Constitution. For instance, one of the biblical principles that our founders in 1776 and 1789 put into our Constitution was the fact that mankind were sinners. And so therefore, we need to have separation of powers. So our Constitution separates governmental powers into the legislature, the executive, and the judiciary. And in fact, Thomas Jefferson said that he was worried that at some point in the future, the judiciary might take over the other 2 branches of government, and then it would collapse the whole nation. And sadly, we're kind of seeing that today, as the judges today are trying to stop the executive branch from doing what should be their job. And so the judiciary is at least trying right now to take things over, just as Jefferson warned us about. And the other kind of interesting thing that I think is actually kind of funny recently is that one of the cries during the Revolution was "No king but King Jesus." That was what a lot of the colonists were saying at the time, "No king but King Jesus." And I found that so funny a couple of weeks ago when these liberals had this No Kings rally. And I was thinking, well, you're really about 250 years behind the times because we already said no king back in 1776. And so you're just a little bit late with that. Um, just as I mentioned, Rick Renner as being a person that you could research about the Ark, there's also a group that I'd like to mention called Wall Builders, wallbuilders.com. And a lot of you probably know about that, but uh, we've used them a lot for a lot of the books that we've written at the National Center for Life and Liberty, because they have been collecting for many, many decades. They've been collecting all the writers of America's founders, um, the original writings. They have the original writings, just thousands of them. And what they're doing right now is they're writing books called The American Story. I think there's going to be 4 or 5 volumes, and they've got the first 2 volumes written now. And you can order those at wallbuilders.com. So I would really welcome all of you to go there and to look up those books, and you can see there they have hundreds of footnotes because they footnote everything from the founders' writings. And the interesting thing that they discovered was that the most frequently cited um, reference in all of the founders' writings was to the Bible. In fact, when Benjamin Franklin was in Paris, he was amazed because he said, well, when I'm over here in Paris, I'll say a quote from the Bible and people don't even know that it's from the Bible. He said, and when I quote from the Bible in America, not only do people know the quotes from the Bible, but they know what chapter and verse it is. So he was quite surprised that, that in France, in Paris, they didn't know that. Um, so, uh, returning to that and to how the the founders, what the founders actually used when they were drafting the Declaration, one of the main things that they used was a series of books actually by William Blackstone. It's a 4-volume set of books written in 1765 by William Blackstone called the Commentaries on the Laws of England. And these commentaries were actually written about English common law, which we also call the natural law today. And the common law in England was actually based on the Bible because English common law actually evolved from church law. Church law was in place first, and then eventually, which we saw, like with Henry VIII, where the church wouldn't let him get divorced. So the church law evolved then into what was the common law or natural law. And this book was written, William Blackstone wrote commentaries on English common law in 1765. And that was just 10 years before the American Revolution. And it was 100 years before Charles Darwin wrote his Origin of the Species in 1859. So Charles Darwin wrote his book just before the start of the Civil War, but Blackstone had written his book just before the start of the American Revolution. So actually, everybody in America was reading Blackstone at the time. In fact, Edmund Burke, one of the parliamentarians in Britain, stood up and told the British Parliament the reason that Americans have such a fierce spirit of liberty is because they all read, and they're all reading Blackstone's commentaries, and Blackstone's commentaries were all, of course, based on biblical law. And he said this is the reason why there's so much widespread interest in the law that everybody in America is reading these. And our founder and second president, John Adams, actually said that it would be more common to see a comet cross the sky than to find an American at that time who was not very well educated and not reading these sorts of books. So they actually became more popular in America than they were in England. And in fact, up until 1951 was the last time that the Supreme Court mentioned that that America was a Christian nation. So from the time of our founding and up until 1950s, everybody in America believed that America was a Christian nation. And of course, now our secularists and anti-God folks have convinced everyone through evolving the law that America is not a Christian nation, and that we no longer have to believe that. So, how did we get Blackstone into the Declaration of Independence? Well, it's right there in the first paragraph. Blackstone described the laws that God had set down for mankind and for nations. He called that the law of nature and of nature's God. And he wrote, and I'm going to quote here, man considered as a creature must necessarily be subject to the laws of his creator, for he is entirely a dependent being. This state of dependence will inevitably oblige the inferior, which is mankind, to bend to the will of his superior, who is the creator God. And consequently, since man depends absolutely upon his maker for everything, it is necessary that he should in all points conform to his maker's will. The will of his maker is called the law of nature. Now, one of the examples that Blackstone used was that God set up, when he created the universe, he set up the law of gravity. And if you can be somebody who says, well, I don't believe in the law of gravity, but even if you don't believe in the law of gravity, if you go and jump off the Empire State Building, you're definitely gonna have a bad outcome. It doesn't matter whether you believe in it or not, you're gonna crash to the ground and die. And the same thing is true for the laws that the Creator God set up for mankind and for nations to follow. And the same thing happens when you don't follow those laws. The nation crashes and dies. And I'm afraid America is in that process now. And we're going to have to reverse that if we don't want America to crash like you would crash if you jumped off the Empire State Building, whether you believed it or not. There's actually 4 places in the Declaration of Independence where God is mentioned. And the first one is in the very first paragraph that talks about the laws of nature and of nature's God. And some of you can probably quote this with me. When in the course of human events it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands which have connected them with another, and to assume among the powers of the earth a separate and equal station to which, and I quote, the laws of nature and of nature's God entitle them, a decent respect to the opinions of mankind requires that they should declare the causes which impel them to the separation. So, what are the laws of nature and of nature's God? Well, the law of nature refers to these physical laws like gravity that God set up at creation. But Blackstone then says, and our American founders and Americans at that time believed this, that the law of nature's God refers to the Bible. Because what Blackstone said was, because it's a little harder to understand the laws of God as they relate to humanity and to nations, God had to write them in the Holy Scriptures for us. So the laws of nature are the laws of nature like gravity, and the laws of nature's God referred to the Bible. So that is mentioned right in the very first paragraph of our Declaration of Independence. And then the second reference to God in the Declaration is all men are created equal, and they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. Among these are life, liberty, and happiness. And by happiness, they really meant property. Another Marco Rubio moment here. So what's happened, interestingly enough, is that here in the 21st century, some of our leaders in America have been quoting that section of the Declaration, but they just kind of accidentally leave out the created by our Creator God part, that we're under God. And one of the most famous people to do that was Barack Obama. When he would quote the Declaration of Independence and quote that section, he would just say, we were created with certain unalienable rights. He doesn't mention the Creator, but of course it was the Creator that gave us these unalienable rights. It wasn't the government. But these days, a lot of our legal scholars are hoping that we'll come to believe that it's the government that gives us our rights, not God. And then therefore government can take them away or give us more or change them or whatever they want to do. So the final two references in the Declaration are at the end. The Declaration ended by appealing to the Supreme Judge of the world for the rectitude of our intentions, which is what George Washington believed, that it was God that performed miracles and helped America win the Revolution. And then the very last reference is with a firm reliance on the protection of divine providence. And Providence was the name that many people at that time used for God. So we've got these four references in the Declaration for God, and the one of the first people to say that America was a Christian nation was Supreme Court Justice David Brewer in 1892, which was only maybe 30 years or so before the Scopes monkey trial. And he spent page after page going through documents of early America, state constitutions, and things like that. And he ended by asking the question, is America a Christian nation? And his answer was a very firm yes, we are a Christian nation. And then, as I said, that continued up until 1951, that America was considered to be a Christian nation. So now we have a few minutes left to ask the question, well, if we were a Christian nation, we were founded as a Christian nation, our Declaration of Independence says that, our Constitution says that. So what happened? Why are we no longer a Christian nation? Why has God now been kicked out of America? Well, it's because of Darwinian evolution. The point of Darwinian evolution was to kick God out of science. And there were some legal scholars at the time who thought, well, this is great. We want to kick God out of the law also. So this is great. Let's adopt Darwinian evolution for the law as well. And so they actually did that. Now that move away started in the around the 1920s, the same time that the Scopes trial was going on, but and it actually started much earlier than that. Charles Darwin, as I mentioned, wrote Origin of the Species in 1858, which was just a few years before the Civil War, and nearly 100 years after Blackstone had written his commentaries. But Darwin's book was not only what scientists were looking for, to kick God out of creation, but it was exactly what some legal scholars were looking for at that time, so that they could kick God out of the law as well as out of science. And so one of the first people to do that was named Oliver Wendell Holmes. He was a Supreme Court justice in the late 1800s and early 1900s. And in 1917, Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr., it was Jr., he wrote a dissenting opinion in the case of Schenck versus the United States, in which he proclaimed at that time, now this was a dissenting opinion in 1917, but he proclaimed at that time that America no longer had to depend on God's law. He believed in the Darwin evolutionary theory, and so he said, and here's the quote from his case. He said, the common law is not a brooding omnipresence in the sky, by which he meant God, this brooding omnipresence. The common law is not a brooding omnipresence in the sky, but the articulate voice of some earthly sovereign or quasi-sovereign that can be identified. So basically, he said, you have no idea who God is, but you certainly know who the judges are. And so now the judges are able to decide what the law is. We don't have to believe in God anymore, because Charles Darwin has already shown us that God isn't necessary. So Herb Titus tells us in his book, both of these beliefs, the belief in evolution, not in creation, and the belief in man, not God, have dominated the teaching of law since the early part of the 20th century. And that is definitely true. And interestingly enough, the way that lawyers were trained in early America, they didn't go to law schools. They were actually trained by apprenticing with a practicing lawyer. And the only textbook that trained these early lawyers in America up until the 1920s, the only textbook they had was Blackstone's commentaries, and that's what they used. And so what they believed was that whenever a case came before them, they had to go back and look at the laws of nature and of nature's God and decide, well, how would God's laws be applied to this particular case? But you may not be too surprised to find out that it was actually Harvard University Law School that was the first law school to put these new Darwinian evolutionary practices into the law. And this happened. Charles William Eliot became the president of Harvard University in 1869, and he loved Darwinian evolution. He'd been looking for a way to move American law away from God. And so he recognized that he could start a law school and he could train lawyers in a different way to just evolve the law from one case to another over time, and then over time to move the law away from God and toward the judges being able to make the laws. And so he found another, this was called the case precedent method, by the way. And so he found a guy to run the law school whose name, interestingly enough, was Christopher Columbus Langdell. And he put Langdell in charge of Harvard Law School. Now, initially, the lawyers and judges didn't like this because they were used to being trained the old way with Blackstone's commentaries, and they believed in the fixed, uniform, and universal laws of divine law that God had given us. But Harvard Law School said, no, 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 it's not God. We can decide the laws for ourselves. And so they taught at Harvard Law School the evolutionary principle that they could just evolve case by case, case upon case, and use the case precedent method to evolve away from God, or we might actually want to call that devolve the law away from God. So groups like the American Civil Liberties Union were trained this way, and so by the 1920s, people like the ACLU and Charles Darrow, who were involved in the Scopes monkey trial, it took them until the 1920s to start to set up their own law schools. And then by the 1960s, these case method trained, that's hard to say, lawyers began to be appointed as judges. And so by the 1960s, then the judges were deciding cases based not on God's law, but on what they believed the law should be. And so we see that in 1968, as I mentioned before, in the Epperson versus Arkansas case, the Supreme Court finally realized the goal that the ACLU had been looking for ever since the Scopes monkey trial, and they decided that evolution was the only thing that could be taught in America's public schools, and creation could no longer be taught. That, by the way, and this is the last thing I'll mention, and then I guess it's about time to open up for questions, but I just wanted to mention that in 1968, the case precedent method was put into action because in 1947, there had been a case called the Everson case, and that was a case in which the judges said that Thomas Jefferson, in his letter to the Danbury Baptists, had written that there was a wall of separation between the church and state, and that there could not be any slightest breach in that wall of separation. And that was not what Thomas Jefferson meant when he wrote in that case about a wall of separation. He meant that there was a wall of separation between the institution of the government and the institution of the church, but he believed that both the church and the state would still be under God, just like in the 1950s, President Eisenhower put under God in our Pledge of Allegiance to the flag to show that we were a Christian nation and not a communist nation, like we were fighting at that time against Russian communism. So basically, even Justice Hugo Black said, we misinterpreted that phrase, but nobody cared, just like nobody cared that the Roe versus Wade case was a lie or that the Scopes monkey trial was a lie. This interpretation by the Supreme Court of what Thomas Jefferson said was also a lie, but nobody cared. And so in 1947, that case precedent was set that there had to be a wall of separation between church and state. In fact, right after that letter, Thomas Jefferson set up a church in the basement of the Capitol building, and every every Sunday he invited different preachers to come and preach. So he obviously didn't believe in this separation nonsense between church and state. So anyway, Justice Hugo Back, like I said, even said that that was a wrong interpretation, but that was the case that the Epperson versus Arkansas case cited to when they were moving American law away from God. They said, well, in 1947, the Epperson case said there was a wall of separation between church and state. And so since the public schools are run by the state, if we taught creation in public schools, that would be something of the church, and so it's not allowed. So that was how things evolved. I mean, there's a lot more I could say. I could go through the cases that show, how evolution, case by case, took God out of the public schools, how case by case they moved into abortion and gay marriage and all these other things, moving it away from God's law and moving it toward whatever the judges would decide. But I think we're at the time to stop now, and I'll turn this back over to Terry. Are you there, Terry? Did I lose you?
Can you hear me?
Yep, I got you now.
Okay, it's
Robin's
Robin.
going to ask some questions first. So
No, I was double secret muted or something. I was already in the process of asking my question.
I can hear you now.
Okay.
So go ahead and ask.
So right at the end, there you kind of touch on it. Basically, what you're saying is it's getting really dark. So I was wondering about the gay marriage thing. Now
Right.
this is being recorded, so I have to YouTube will censor us if I don't choose my words carefully.
Yes, well, I
How
can tell you how that came about with the case method, if that's what you're asking.
yes.
Yes. Okay. So in that I can answer that pretty quickly, actually. In 1986, there was a case heard by the United States Supreme Court called Bowers versus Hardwick, and that was a case that by one vote failed to say that the law in Georgia, a Georgia law that made homosexual sodomy a crime, they came within one vote of agreeing that it was a crime, and they continued to say that it was a crime. But then 10 years later, in 1996, there was a second case called Romer v. Evans, and in that case, the Supreme Court had evolved to the place, and they had other case precedents and things that they could rely on. That in 1996 in Romer v. Evans, they said that the Colorado state constitution was trying to institute a constitutional amendment to their state constitution to say that giving special rights to homosexuals was unconstitutional. And the Supreme Court voted that that was not correct, and that the Colorado Constitution and anybody else in America could decriminalize homosexual sodomy. So basically, that was a good thing. I mean, Americans don't want to be like the Muslims, where they throw all the homosexuals off the rooftops. I mean,
Oh, absolutely not. No, I don't. Yeah.
but then this continued to evolve, so that in 2003, there was a case called Lawrence v. Texas, and that basically struck down all the laws in America that still said that sodomy was a crime. And that was kind of interesting because there actually had been in the Casey, one of the abortion cases that was written by Sandra Day O'Connor called the Casey case, they had a mystery passage in there. And basically what the mystery passage said was that it was in relation to abortion, but basically what they said was that every person in America had the right to decide their own concept of existence, of meaning, of the universe, and of the mystery of life. So basically what that mystery passage said was that every person in America to decide from themselves what their rights should be and what their morals should be.
That's
And
very dangerous.
yeah, and so that was in 1993, but that was the case precedent on which the Lawrence case was decided to say that, it wasn't a crime. So then it's interesting because in 2000, when George W. Bush was running for president, the Republicans actually put constitutional amendments in many states to basically prohibit gay marriage, because that was the thing that the gays were trying to get at that time, was gay marriage. And of course, we know that God's law says that marriage is only between a man and a woman. And until, the 2000s, until the 21st century, everybody in America believed that God's law had defined marriage. The state didn't define marriage. So in 2000, these constitutional amendments were put there just to get more people out to vote for George Bush, right? So then it was amazing that just 15 years later, in 2015, there was a case of Obergefell versus Hodges, and the Supreme Court decided then that, just like they had decided that women had a constitutional right to kill their babies in the womb, just like slaves in the South had a right to kill their slaves if they wanted to. They were property, not people. And so babies in the womb were also property and not people, and their mothers could kill them if they wanted to. But just like that, we decided to abandon God's law there. And so in the 2015 case of Obergefell versus Hodges, the United States Supreme Court said that there was a constitutional right for same-sex couples to marry. So that was pretty amazing. But that's how that evolved. It evolved from from saying that homosexuality is no longer a crime, which most people agreed with. But then they evolved that in the law up until the fact where there was a constitutional right to gay marriage, which of course was never in the Constitution, and was definitely opposed to the laws of nature and of nature's God in creation and in our founding fathers. So does that answer your question there?
Yes, that was very good. And that kind of took me back to Blackstone and France, which was another question. I have heard of Blackstone, but I didn't know that he wrote commentaries, etc. And
Yeah, commentaries on English common law. And of course, America adopted the common law of England, but we actually believed it, whereas England really didn't. I guess you could put it that way. And
uh,
France neither, because France had a revolution 10 years after our revolution. And of course, they moved totally away from God and made everything secular. I mean, they didn't even have a 7-day week anymore, so they wouldn't have to have a seventh day of rest like the Bible said. And of course, that led to the guillotine and all the people losing their heads. And, it was horrible. And of course, it never worked out.
and how would I find Blackstone's commentaries?
Oh, you can order them in Amazon. Yeah, just go to Amazon and get the commentary. They're not easy to read. They're kind of like Herb Titus's book. They're we're not quite as intelligent anymore as people were in America in 1776, and so they're not an easy read, but you can find them at Amazon. Yeah.
Oh, I was going to see if I could find where I could listen to them on.
I don't know about listening to them, but you can certainly buy the books. I imagine somebody's probably, well, I don't know. That'd be a lot of books to read, and wouldn't be easy reading or probably easy listening. I don't know. I like to actually go back and read the quotes, because the quotes are kind of written in early English, and they're, Blackstone wrote kind of that way, and so he's kind of you kind of almost, at least I do, I have to kind of look at the quotations in there and maybe kind of read them 2 or 3 times to figure out exactly what they're saying. But yeah, and Herb Titus has a lot of quotes from Blackstone in his book, God, Man, and Law, the Biblical Principles. So that book, God, Man, and Law, Herbert Titus, is also available on Amazon, and there's a lot of quotes from Blackstone in that book. So that might be another option, although I don't think his books are on audio either.
That's okay. We're going to wrap up the live stream and the recording because YouTube has some very specific principles, and we've
Right.
been threatened with being banned before. So, Terry, let's go ahead and wrap up the live stream and the recording, and then I can ask some more questions.
Barbara, why don't you tell people one more time about the ministry or the organization that you work for, and how people
Oh, thank
can
you. Yes. The
find out
National,
more about it?
yeah, the National Center for Life and Liberty. What we basically do, and honestly, when God called me back during the Clarence Thomas hearings to study law. He said he said, I want you, and it was so clear. I mean, it wasn't written on the wall, but it was so clear to me it could have been. He said, I want you to go to law school and defend churches and my people. And so what the National Center for Life and Liberty does is we defend churches, we help them to stay legal, because there's so many laws now about churches and things that it's kind of complicated. And so we help them to develop policies and bylaws and all those kind of things. And then we help them, first of all, we help them not to get sued. But if they did get sued, then we defend them. So we work primarily with churches of all kinds, and Jewish synagogues. We work with Jewish synagogues, we work with Catholic schools, we work with obviously a lot of Protestants and Baptists, and anybody who believes the Bible, we help them. Yeah, that's what we do.
Okay, great. And it's the National Center for Life and Liberty. And we have a link on Facebook in the comments, and then we also have a link on our website, which
Oh, that's great.
we are again Creation Fellowship Santee, and you can find a list of our upcoming speakers by going to tinyurl.com/CF Santee, C like creation, F like fellowship, and this word Santee is spelled Santee. And join us in 2 weeks when we are back with Krista. Oh, I'm so sorry. I just totally spaced on her name, but
Jewett,
Krista Jewett.
yeah.
Krista Jewett from Saltwater Studies, and she'll be talking to us about the gospel in creation. That's July 24th. And with that, we're going to go ahead and sign off for tonight.